She was 19 years old, and she had $2 and a canvas satchel of her grandfather's tools, and on the morning this story begins she used the $2 to buy the largest building in the county. Her name was Rosalind Pike, and the thing she bought was the Larkspur Grand, the opera house at the head of Main Street in Larkspur, Kansas. 400 seats, and a gilded proscenium and a painted ceiling of clouds that had stood locked and dark for 40 years, and that the county had spent those 40 years being ashamed of. They had built it in the good years, when Larkspur believed it was going to be a city. The whole county had subscribed to it. Farmers and shopkeepers and railroad men putting in $1 and $5 and $100. Because a town with an opera house was a town that had arrived, and the Larkspur Grand had gone up in 18 months of proud labor, the finest house between Kansas City and Denver, and for 6 seasons it had been the joy of that country. And then, 40 years before this story begins, the scandal had come, and the doors had closed in disgrace, and they had never opened again. The scandal was counterfeiting. In the 6th season of the Larkspur Grand, the federal authorities had come into the county in force and broken up a counterfeiting operation that had been passing forged notes through 4 states. And the trail had led them to the opera house, and beneath the opera house, under the stage, in the great cavern of machinery and traps and cellarage that lies beneath any working theater, they had found the workshop, presses, plates, ink, paper, the whole apparatus of the ring, in the one place in Larkspur where hammering and machinery ran all night without a soul thinking it strange. And they had arrested the man who kept that machinery. His name was Augustus Pike, the theater's stage machinist, and he was Rosalind's great-grandfather, and he went to a federal prison for 11 years and died there in his 10th, and the Larkspur Grand closed forever, and the county which had subscribed its savings to build a temple of art discovered it had built a mint for criminals, and the shame of it soured that town for 2 generations. Everyone knew Augustus Pike was guilty. It was the simplest case in the world. The workshop was under the stage. The machinist was the only man in Larkspur who had the keys to what was under the stage. The machinist knew the understage works better than any living person, having built half of them himself, and the machinist, when the marshals came, could not tell them who else it might have been, and was tried, and convicted, and buried in a prison yard. His family had believed him. That was the whole inheritance of the Pikes for 40 years. That and the tools, 3 generations of them poor and slighted in that county. The kin of the man who had shamed Larkspur, holding to the thing Augustus Pike had said at his trial and written in his letters until he died, which was that he had been put there, that the ring had used his shop because it was perfect for them, and used his name because he was perfect for that too, and that the men who had done it were not strangers passing through, but men of Larkspur, men in good coats, and that if the marshals had troubled to look under the trap-room floor instead of merely into the trap-room, they would have found what would have hanged the lot of them. Under the trap-room floor. Nobody had ever known what he meant. The marshals had torn out the workshop and taken the presses and sealed the building, and the trap-room floor was a floor. And Augustus Pike had died in prison, saying a thing his family did not understand, and Rosalind Pike, who was the last of that family, orphaned that spring and thrown out of her aunt's house at 19 for the crime of being one mouth too many, understood it perfectly, because she was the only person left alive who had been taught how a stage works. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Rosalind Pike, and the opera house that a county was ashamed of, and what lay beneath the stage. And if a story of a framed man and the great-granddaughter who came back for him is what you came for tonight, light a lantern with us, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what part of this wide country you are watching from. We are always glad of the company here in the dark. To understand Rosalind's inheritance, you have to understand what a stage machinist was, in the days when the Larkspur Grand was built, because it is a trade the world has nearly forgotten. Beneath the stage of any real theater of that era there was a second theater, a working cavern 2 stories deep, and it was full of machinery. It had to be. In those days, before electricity, an opera house made its magic with rope and wood and iron and human muscle. Scenery flew up into the loft on counterweighted lines, actors rose through the floor on trap lifts, whole sets were changed in the dark in 15 seconds by men hauling on tackle below, and the ghost in the fifth act came up out of the earth on a little platform run by a windlass in the cellar. The man who built and ran all of that, who could calculate a counterweight and hang a line and time a trap to the beat of an orchestra, was the stage machinist, and in a house like the Larkspur Grand he was the most skilled workman in the county, and everybody in the trade knew it. Augustus Pike had been such a man. He had come out from Philadelphia, where he had learned the trade in the old houses, and he had built the whole understage of the Larkspur Grand with his own hands and his own designs, and he had taught it, as tradesmen taught in those days, to his own children, because knowledge was the only estate he had. And when he went to prison, that knowledge went on passing down the ruined Pike family. Useless and honored, from his daughter to hers, the way a family will keep the tools and the songs and the sayings of a dead trade long after the last of them has any use for it. Rosalind Pike had grown up on a rented farm 40 miles from any theater, and had never seen a play in her life, and could name every part of a counterweight system, and knew the mathematics of a trap lift, and had learned as a child, at her mother's knee, to read the working drawing of a stage the way other girls learned to read a recipe. She had, besides, the tools. Augustus Pike's canvas roll of machinist's tools had come back from the prison with his effects, and had been kept by 4 generations of a family too poor to own anything else worth keeping. And when her aunt put her out in the spring with $2 and no place to go, Rosalind Pike walked the 40 miles into Larkspur to look at the building her family was famous for, because she had nothing else to do with her feet, and she stood in the weeds at the head of Main Street and looked up at the boarded doors of the Larkspur Grand, and she thought, standing there, the thought that this whole story hangs from. She had not meant to come. That was the strange part, and she thought about it often afterward. Her mother had died in the winter, the last of the Pikes, but for Rosalind, worn out at 42 from a life of other people's work, and Rosalind had gone to an aunt by marriage who had taken her in with the sighing air of a woman doing a great and thankless charity, and had reminded her of it daily, and had put her out in April when the spring work was done and a spare mouth stopped being worth its labor. And Rosalind had gone out onto the road with $2 and her mother's shawl and the canvas roll of tools she would not have left behind if she had been starving, and she had walked in no direction for the whole of a day until she came to a crossroads with a signpost, and one arm of the signpost said Larkspur, and she had stood there in the dust a long while. Everything in her life had come from that town. She had never seen it. Her family's poverty came from it, and its scorn of them, and the name she carried that made people's faces change, and the tools on her back, and the whole strange, useless education of a dead trade that her mother had poured into her by lamplight on a rented farm. She had grown up hearing Larkspur the way some children grow up hearing about a war, and now she had nothing at all left to lose by looking at it, which is a freedom, if a cold one. So she turned down that arm of the signpost and walked 2 days, and came into Larkspur on a bright morning and walked up Main Street past the bank and the hotel to the head of the street, where the great boarded building stood. Her great-grandfather had said the truth was under the trap-room floor. And Rosalind Pike, who knew what was under a stage, knew that there is nothing under a trap-room floor. The trap-room is the bottom. It is the cellar of the theater, the lowest floor, dug into the ground, and beneath its floor is the earth of Kansas and nothing else. Any marshal who heard a convicted man say, "Look under the trap-room floor," would take it for the raving of a desperate liar, which is exactly what they had taken it for, and any member of his own family, hearing it repeated for 40 years, would take it for a family mystery, which is what they had taken it for. But a stage machinist would hear it differently, because a stage machinist knows that in a theater, a floor is very often not a floor. She got in through a coal chute at the back on the first night, which was trespass, and she made it lawful within the week, because the Pikes were not thieves, whatever the county said. The Larkspur Grand had passed to the county for taxes a generation back and sat on the books as a derelict that no one would take. 400 seats of shame that the town could neither use nor bear to tear down. And when Rosalind Pike walked into the county office and asked its price, the clerk looked up the entry and told her, with the flat humor of clerks, that the county would sell her the Opera House for the $2 filing fee and throw in the ghost for nothing. She paid it. She signed the name Pike on the deed to the building her great-grandfather had gone to prison for. And the clerk did not connect the name, and the county of Larkspur, which had been ashamed of that building for 40 years, sold it to the family it had ruined for $2, and thought no more about it. She lived in it. That was the first thing. Rosalind Pike moved into the star dressing room of the Larkspur Grand with a bedroll and a lamp, because it was hers, and it was dry, and she had nowhere else, and she took work in the town 6 days a week in the laundry of the Larkspur Hotel, and every evening walked home up Main Street to her opera house, and lit her lamp and went down under the stage. And what she found down there, in the great dark cavern beneath the Larkspur Grand, was her great-grandfather's mind. For the understage works were still in place. The marshals had torn out the counterfeiter's apparatus 40 years before and gone away, and the theater had simply been locked. And everything Augustus Pike had built remained, the bridges and the traps, the trees of rope, the great drums and windlasses, the cut in the stage floor where the ghost trap ran, all of it dusty and stiff and perfectly intact in the still dry dark. Rosalind moved through it with her lamp night after night, touching things she had known the names of since she was 5, and had never once seen, and she wept the first night, and after that she got to work, because she had come to look for something. She was looking for the lie in the machinery. And it took her 9 weeks to find it, and when she found it, it was in the one place she should have looked first, which was in the arithmetic. Those were strange, happy, exhausting weeks, and she never forgot them. She was up at 5 for the hotel laundry and stood over the coppers all day with her hands in scalding water and lye, and came home at 7 up a street where people crossed to avoid the Pike girl who had bought the shame of the county, and let herself into a 400-seat opera house that belonged to her, and ate her bread sitting on the edge of the stage in the dark, and then lit her lamp and went down the stairs to work. She searched the understage the way her mother had taught her a machinist searches anything, which is systematically, and without hurry, quartering the great cavern and going over it foot by foot. She traced every rope in the house from its pin to its purpose. She oiled and freed and turned every wheel she found, learning what it did. She made drawings, dozens of them, on brown paper from the laundry, until she had built up on paper the whole system of the Larkspur Grand, as her great-grandfather had built it in iron and timber, and could sit on the stage steps at midnight and look at the drawings and see the mind that had made it. And it was a good mind. That was the thing that grew in her through those 9 weeks, and it mattered more than the search. Her great-grandfather's work was honest work. Every line in that house was hung right. Every counterweight was true. Every joint was cut by a man who cared. You cannot fake that. A shoddy man leaves shoddy everywhere, and Augustus Pike had left nothing shoddy anywhere in that building. And Rosalind, who had been raised on a family's faith that a dead man was innocent, found that faith turning into something firmer as she worked, because she was reading his character out of his own carpentry. And it was not the character of a man who passed bad money. It was the character of a man who could not bear a thing built crooked. There is a windlass under any large stage, a great horizontal drum with a hand crank and a gear train, that drives the main trap lift, the platform that carries actors and scenery up through the stage floor. Rosalind knew what such a windlass is built to do. The main trap of a house like the Larkspur Grand lifts a platform, some scenery, and 2 or 3 actors, call it 1,000 pounds at the very outside, and a machinist builds his gearing and his drum for that, with a decent margin, because iron and gearing cost money and a theater company counts every dollar. The windlass under the Larkspur Grand was built to lift 8 tons. Rosalind Pike stood in front of it with her lamp on the 9th week and worked the numbers out 3 times, on the back of a laundry receipt, the way her mother had taught her. The diameter of the drum, the ratio of the gear train, the size of the shaft, the specification of the rope. It was a monster. It was gearing for a bridge, for a mine hoist, for the lifting of something that weighed several tons, and it was sitting under a stage where nothing heavier than a painted forest and a fat tenor had ever needed lifting. And Augustus Pike, who was the most careful and economical machinist in 4 states, had built it that way on purpose, and had run its rope down through a series of blocks into the trap room floor. Into it. Not to it. The rope of that great windlass went down through the floor of the trap room, the lowest floor, the floor beneath which there is nothing but Kansas, and Rosalind Pike crouched and put her lamp down on that floor and looked at it properly for the first time, as a machinist and not as a person walking on a floor, and she saw the seam. It ran in a rectangle, 12 feet by 18, and it was beautiful work. The joint disguised in the run of the planking, caulked and dusted and dark with 40 years, invisible unless you were on your knees with a lamp looking for it, because the arithmetic of a windlass had told you it must be there. The trap room floor of the Larkspur Grand was itself a trap. Her great-grandfather, building his theater's cellar, had built into it one last machine that was on no plan and in no accounting, a lifting section of floor, 8 tons of timber and earthfill, that could be raised on the great windlass to open a chamber beneath the lowest floor of the building. And he had said it, plainly, at his trial and in his letters, for 40 years, to marshals and lawyers and his own weeping family, and not one of them had understood the sentence, because not one of them was a stage machinist. Look under the trap room floor. It took her 3 more weeks to raise it, and she did that work with a care that was near to prayer. The windlass had stood 40 years. She stripped and cleaned and greased the gear train, made new pawls for the ratchet where the old ones had rusted thin, replaced the rotted lifting rope with cable she bought with 3 months of laundry wages, and tested every part of it before she ever put a strain on the floor, because she was Augustus Pike's blood, and she knew that 8 tons coming down wrong kills whoever is under it. And on a Sunday in the autumn, alone in the empty opera house, Rosalind Pike set her hands on the crank of her great-grandfather's monstrous windlass and began to turn. The floor came up. It came up slow and level and silent. 4 inches, a foot, 3 feet. The great counterweighted section rising exactly as it had been built to rise, 40 years asleep and perfect in its working, and the lamplight went down into the chamber beneath the lowest floor of the Larkspur Grand, and Rosalind Pike locked the pawl and climbed down into what her great-grandfather had died trying to tell the world about. She was shaking so hard on the crank that she had to stop twice and stand back and breathe. It is one thing to work out an arithmetic on the back of a laundry receipt, and another to feel 8 tons of a dead man's carpentry answer your hands and begin to move. And it moved sweetly. That was what she remembered most, and what she told people about for the rest of her life, after 40 years of stillness, with new grease and a new rope and its ratchet made good. Augustus Pike's monstrous secret windlass lifted 8 tons of floor so smoothly that a lamp set on the rising planks did not so much as flicker. He had built it to be worked by one person alone, in the dark, in a hurry, and quietly. And it did all of that 40 years after he was dead, for a great-granddaughter he never knew was coming. It was the ring's true room. The marshals, 40 years before, had found the workshop in the trap room and taken the presses and gone away satisfied. They had never known there was a floor beneath the floor, and the men who did know had never dared come back for what was in it. Because the building was federal sealed and then county owned, and to be seen going into the shamed opera house at night was to hang oneself. And so it had waited, sealed under 8 tons of Augustus Pike's own carpentry, for 40 years. There was money in it. There was a great deal of money in it, the ring's working capital and its stock of finished notes, some genuine and some not. In strong boxes and canvas sacks, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth as such things were counted then. more money than the county of Larkspur had ever seen in one room. But it was the papers that made the county shake. The Ring had kept books. They had to. There were shares to divide and passers to pay, and 4 states of distribution to manage, and so there was a ledger in that chamber. And it named them. It named the men who had financed the operation, and the men who had run it, and the men who had passed the notes, with the dates and the sums and the shares, and the names in that ledger were not the names of drifters. They were the leading names of Larkspur, the men in the good coats, exactly as Augustus Pike had said in a courtroom 40 years before, while the county laughed at him. The president of the bank, Colonel Barnaby Fry, 2 of the county commissioners, the man who had been mayor, the owner of the freight line, a member of the very committee that had raised the subscription to build the opera house. In the first place, which was how the Ring had gotten the use of its cellar in the beginning. They had built themselves a mint under a temple, and, when the marshals came, they had done the simplest thing in the world. They had let it fall on the workmen. And with the ledger, in that chamber, wrapped in oilcloth and weighted with a wrench, was a statement in Augustus Pike's own hand, written in the last week before his arrest, when he had understood what was coming. He had known. That was the thing that broke Rosalind, reading it by lamplight in the chamber under the stage. He had found the workshop in his own trap room. Some months before, he had gone to Colonel Fry, the most respected man in Larkspur, to report it, not knowing that Fry was its master, and from that day he had watched the trap close around him, and had understood that he was a poor mechanic with an accusation against the first men of the county, and that no one on earth would believe him. And Augustus Pike, being what he was, had not run. He had done the only useful thing a doomed craftsman could do. He had gone down into his own cellar in the nights, and he had taken the Ring's books, and he had put them in the one hiding place in Larkspur that he alone in all the world knew existed, and he had sealed it under 8 tons of floor. And he had gone to his trial and told the truth in the plainest words he had, and the truth had sounded like madness. And he had gone to prison for 11 years and died there, keeping the secret of where the proof lay for the day someone of his blood and his trade would come to lift the floor. He had written it out for that person. The statement ended. Rosalind said afterward, with a line she could never read aloud without stopping, that he was sorry to leave his family such a poor legacy, and that he hoped whoever came at last to raise this floor would forgive him for the years, and would please remember that he had never in his life passed a bad dollar or built a crooked thing. What followed came fast, because federal paper does not care how long a county has been comfortable. Rosalind Pike did not take one banknote out of that chamber. She went to the marshals in Kansas City, and she brought them back to Larkspur, and she raised the floor for them on her great-grandfather's windlass, while they stood in the trap room and watched 8 tons of theater rise silently in front of them on 40-year-old gearing, which several of them said afterward was the strangest thing they ever saw in 20 years of service. The ledger was examined and proved genuine, and the case that had been closed for 40 years was reopened by the Treasury, and though the men whose names were in that book were dead almost to a man, the finding was made, and made publicly, that the Larkspur Ring had been organized and financed by the leading citizens of the county, and that Augustus Pike, stage machinist, had been innocent, had in fact been the only man who tried to report it, and had been convicted and had died in prison for the crime of the men who sat in the front row of his own theater. The federal court vacated his conviction. It is a strange, dry piece of paper, a vacated conviction for a man 50 years dead, and Rosalind Pike had it framed and hung in the lobby of the Larkspur Grand, where it hangs still. The county did not enjoy it. There were families in Larkspur named Fry, and named for the commissioners and the mayor, respectable families of 40 years standing, whose grandfathers' names were in that ledger. And there was a bank on Main Street with a name on it that had to be painted over, and the whole comfortable understanding of the county about who its good people were came apart in a single autumn. But under the shock there was, and Rosalind felt it, an enormous relief, because a county that has been ashamed of itself for 40 years turns out to be glad, in the end, to learn that the shame belonged to somebody in particular. Rosalind Pike was made rich by it. In the way the law provides, the genuine money in the chamber was forfeit and the counterfeit destroyed. But there were rewards standing on that old case, and there was compensation, argued and granted, for a man wrongly imprisoned and a family ruined by it, and the sum, with 40 years upon it, was very large. And what she did with it, she had known she would do since the first night she slept in the Star dressing room with the dust of the place around her. She reopened the Larkspur Grand. It took 2 years and most of the money, and she did much of the work herself, on her back under the stage with her great-grandfather's tools, restoring the bridges and the traps in the trees of rope, teaching herself by his drawings the parts of the trade her family had passed down in words alone. And on a night in the autumn of the 2nd year, 43 years after the doors had closed in disgrace, the Larkspur Grand opened, and the whole county came, in their good clothes, up Main Street to the building they had been ashamed of, and the lamps were lit, and the painted clouds shone on the ceiling, and the curtain went up on a stage run by a Pike, as it had been at the beginning. She ran that house for 50 years and made it the best small opera house in the state, and she was its manager and its owner and, to the end of her life, its stage machinist, and she was known through the whole of the Midwest as the woman who could still time a trap to an orchestra beat. And every season, in the first week, she opened the trap room to the public and raised the floor on the old windlass for anyone who cared to see, and told the story standing in the chamber underneath, and there were people in Larkspur who came every single year to hear it, and children who grew up on it, and it became at last the thing the county told about itself instead of the shame. She had been 19 years old, and thrown out with $2 and a roll of tools that were the only thing her family had left, and she had spent every cent on a locked and shamed building that a whole county wished had never been built. It was the best $2 she ever spent. There is a thing worth carrying out of a story like this one, and it is not the money in the chamber, though the money bought back a theater and a name. It is this, that Augustus Pike told the truth, out loud, in a courtroom, to the law, and the truth was heard by everyone, and understood by no one, for 40 years, not because it was hidden, but because there was nobody in the room who spoke his language. Look under the trap room floor. It was a complete and accurate confession of where the proof lay, given freely, and it sounded like nonsense to marshals and lawyers and even to his own grieving family, and it stayed nonsense until one person came along who knew what he knew. The world is full of people trying to tell us the truth in a language we have not learned. Sometimes the thing that unlocks a mystery is not a new clue at all, but the one person who finally understands the clue everyone has already heard. So we will leave you tonight with a question, and we do read every answer. Has there ever been someone in your life whose plain words you did not understand until years later? And what did you finally hear in them when you did? Tell us in the comments below. Light a lantern with us, subscribe if this story kept you company tonight, and we will see you down the line, where the next story is already waiting in the dark.